The Southeast Asian realm consists of 11 countries situated on the mainland and on thousands of islands, each island with its own character from the cultural sources of its residents. The realm's giant in terms of territory and population is the archipelago of Indonesia. The mainland part of the realm borders China and India, from which cultural influences come into play. In addition to Indonesia, some places you might be familiar with here are the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Physical geography in this realm resembles the Middle American islands and peninsulas surrounding a populous mainland. Much like Middle America, we see earthquakes due to tectonic plates colliding, and here we also have volcanic eruptions and tropical cyclones. This realm is included in the Pacific Ring of Fire. The earthquake that hit near Japan in 2004 and the ensuing tsunami caused massive amounts of damage in Indonesia, and volcanic eruptions are a continuous threat. One exception to the disasters is the island of Borneo, which is called a stable mini-continent due to the lack of active volcanoes and tremors. However, the rainforests here and elsewhere in the realm are eroding as human intervention continues, in large part due to the harvesting of palm oil, a very lucrative crop. Looking at 10A, we can see a number of stepping stones toward New Guinea, which served as a path for species, humans and animals alike, to migrate, and this realm is now well known for its biodiversity. Scientists estimate that 10% of the Earth's plant and animal species can be found in this small realm. South Asia has plenty of sources of moisture, from the excessive rainfalls of Indonesia and the Philippines to the major rivers of the mainland, and we can see from our population map that spatial relationship between people and water sources. There are 4 major rivers in this realm, 3 of which originate in China: the Mekong, the Red, the Irrawaddy, and finally the Chao Phraya. The Mekong borders 5 of the realm's countries, beginning at the Tibetan Plateau of China and traveling 2,600 miles to southern Vietnam. The other 3 rivers are essentially local. The Red River, important for Vietnam, the Chao Phraya in Thailand, and the Irrawaddy in Myanmar. Let's look at population. Immediately, we see a massive concentration on the small island of Jawa in Indonesia, with a population of 150 million. Jawa is the most highly urbanized island of Indonesia, though the country is still not yet highly urbanized, with 50% of its people living off the land, and are relatively successful at doing so due to the fertile soil. There are some fast-growing urban areas on Jawa. With the exception of Indonesia, however, we are looking at smaller populations in this realm. As far as the ethnic mosaic goes, we can look at figure 10A4 to give us an idea of the distribution of ethno-linguistic groups in the realm, and we also notice the major ethnic groups roughly correspond to the modern political states. Burmese dominate Myanmar, which was formerly called Burma, Thai occupying Thailand, which was formerly known as Siam, the Khmer in Cambodia and Laos, and the Vietnamese populating the strip of land that borders the South China Sea. This realm is also home to a number of ethnic minorities from outside of the realm. The largest immigrant minority in Southeast Asia is the Chinese, who arrived over the course of hundreds of years and established Chinatowns in major cities, and they have been persecuted throughout the 20th century. We like to call Southeast Asia a crossroads of religions. Since there has been migration into this realm from India, we have Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, and today 90% of Indonesia's population is Muslim. Myanmar, Thailand, and Cambodia are overwhelmingly Buddhist. Vietnam has traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism. We look again to colonialism to explain how the political map of this region eventually evolved. We saw earlier when we looked at China that there was a powerful center of indigenous culture, but in Southeast Asia things were much more of a patchwork, where none of the cultures had risen to imperial power by the time the Europeans arrived. So this was an area that was heavily molded by European colonists. The textbook states that, were it not for the colonial intervention, it is unlikely that the 17,000 islands of far-flung Indonesia would today constitute the world's 4th largest country in terms of population. But I think that this is an overly charitable view of colonialism. The Dutch, British, French, Spanish, and even Americans carved up this area just as they had done with Africa and assumed control over ports and trade, stifling cultures in the process. First, we have French Indochina, which combined 5 French dependencies into 3 political states, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We will look more closely at the disaster that colonialism caused in this region shortly. The British were responsible for Burma and Malaya, as well as part of Borneo and a number of small islands. Burma was granted independence when India became independent. Malaya, which refers to the geographic area of the Malaysian peninsula, eventually became the Malaysian Foundation. The Netherlands had their hands in what became known as the Spice Islands due to the spices that were grown there, and the Dutch East India Company took control of these islands and made massive profits. The Philippines had been controlled by Spain since the 16th century, who made a boatload of money as a stop on the trade route between southern China and western Mexico. There was an uprising that coincided with the Spanish-American War, upon which the settlement determined that the U.S. would replace Spain as the colonial proprietor, further upsetting the Filipinos, who were eventually squashed after a bloody fight. The Philippines became independent after World War II. This chapter gives us a good chance to examine states and boundaries. We can think of boundaries, which are not really confined to land, as contracts between states. To really get at what this contract involves, treaties contain the definition of boundary segments referring to landforms or specific terrain. Surveyors translate descriptions into lines in a process called delimitation, and states mark stretches of their borders with tangible barriers in a process called demarcation. But there are different ways of classifying boundaries, which we've already seen in this course. Think of the African Transition Zone as an example. Physiographic boundaries conform to elongated features of the natural landscape, but ethnocultural boundaries coincide with historic breaks or transitions in the cultural landscape, which is how we now have that zone that separates sub-Saharan Africa from northern Africa. The boundaries we are looking at in this realm were defined by colonial powers, which we've also seen when we studied both parts of Africa. Sometimes made no sense, combining people of different cultures into one state or country, which causes tension. Definitely check out the antecedent boundaries, the subsequent boundaries, superimposed boundaries, and relict boundaries as well. Also make sure you look at the differences between compact states, protruded states, elongated states, fragmented states, and perforated states. Let's move on to look more closely at the regions and states of Southeast Asia. The size of the mainland, which is 2.1 million square kilometers, is smaller than the combined size of the islands, which is 2.4 million square kilometers. We have Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in the east, Thailand and Myanmar in the west. Though the Buddhist religion dominates, we do have a multicultural and multi-ethnic region. We'll start with Vietnam, and we should mention the ridiculous domino theory, which states that the destabilization and conflict from one country can diffuse into neighboring countries, something that can happen but not necessarily will happen. And the U.S. waged an expensive and bloody war based on this theory that all parties are still paying the price of. Somewhat strangely, based on other versions of colonialism we have seen, the French actually recognized the regional differences in French Indochina when they colonized it, so they divided it into 3 units: Tonkin, Cochin China, and Annam. The Japanese invaded in 1940 but were distracted by World War II, and the French could not regain control despite their best efforts, including killing anywhere from 125,000 to 400,000 civilians as they tried to hold on to their crumbling empire. After chasing out the French, Vietnam split when separate regimes took control: a communist regime in northern Hanoi and a non-communist regime in southern Saigon. The U.S., in their futile attempt to contain communism from spreading throughout the world, waged a relentless and losing war that spilled over into Laos and Cambodia and resulted in over 1 million dead. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., if you've never seen it, is a sight to behold. Designed by Maya Lin, the shape of the wall is meant to resemble an open wound, and the relief contains the names of all of the U.S. casualties and soldiers missing in action from the war. Seeing all of the names is a truly emotional experience. And yet, American casualties account for only a fraction of the number of people, many civilians, killed in this conflict. After all of that bloodshed, Vietnam still has a communist government today, truly a war fought for nothing. We'll next look at Cambodia, heir to the Khmer Empire, and 90% of the current population is ethnic Khmers. Cambodia's king was overthrown by the military, and the military regime was overthrown by communist revolutionaries known as the Khmer Rouge, which eventually killed 2.1 million of the 8 million people. Vietnam invaded, which led to even more terror for these people. Today, Cambodia continues its recovery. Subsistence farming can only do so much. Laos suffers from being landlocked and surrounded by more powerful and populous neighbors, one of which is China. Laos has no railroads, few paved roads, and barely any industry, and to make matters worse, less than 5% of its land is suitable for agriculture. Though the country has been slow to modernize, a high-speed railway will eventually pull Laos closer into the Chinese orbit. Thailand is the leading state of the mainland region, which is with its capital of Bangkok as the largest urban center in the mainland region. It has suffered a bit from political instability. Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, is one of the world's poorest and most isolated countries. It is oppressed by a military dictatorship and influenced by a complicated colonial legacy. We move on to our next region, which we call Insular Southeast Asia. Here we have 6 of the realm's 11 states: Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, Brunei, the Philippines, and East Timor, all of which are very diverse. Malaysia is a mainland island fragmented state, so part of the national territory lies on the continent and the other on Borneo. Malaya refers to the peninsular part of the Federation. The Malays displaced Aboriginal communities and now represent a slight majority of the population and are mostly Muslim. Brunei is also located on the Borneo. Brunei is a tiny sultanate, the last remnant of a former Islamic kingdom, and the discovery of oil and natural gas has made Brunei the richest country in Southeast Asia. You can see from the map that Brunei is actually fragmented, with a little sliver of Malaysian land in between. Singapore seceded from the Malaysian Federation in 1965 and became a sovereign mini-state. Singapore has a small area, just 239 square miles, and benefits from its strategic location as an entrepot. Indonesia is the 4th largest country in the world in terms of human population and is the world's most expansive archipelago, with more than 17,000 volcanic islands consisting of 242 million people. 5 islands dominate the system, but only New Guinea's western half is under Indonesian control. The 4 remaining islands, the Greater Sunda Islands, are Jawa, the smallest and most populous, Sumatra, Kalimantan, and Sulawesi. Jawa is the core of Indonesia and has almost 150 million inhabitants, is very agriculturally productive as well as highly urbanized, and contains the megalopolis of Jakarta, Bogor, Tangerang, and Bekasi. Sumatra is larger than Jawa but has a smaller population and agricultural potential. Kalimantan is the Indonesian sector of the island of Borneo, which we've already looked at. And Sulawesi's volcanic mountain ranges and Papua, the western part of the island of New Guinea, round out the rest of the islands. East Timor, or Timor-Leste, is a remnant of the Portuguese colonialist, which was annexed by Indonesian forces, and after a bitter struggle, its people were granted the right to vote on independence, which they overwhelmingly supported. Nation building has been problematic due to Australia's interest in supporting Indonesia's annexation. Finally, we visit the Philippines, made up of more than 700 islands, many quite small. The islands can be divided into 3 groups: Luzon, Visayan, and Mindanao. The Philippines is an ethnic melting pot of influence and is 81% Roman Catholic, 9% Protestant, and 5% Muslim. There are almost 90 Malay languages spoken on the island, but Tagalog is the official language. Many Filipino take jobs in foreign countries, and the remittances that the emigrants send home comprise a substantial part of the economy.